Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, whenever you happen to be watching this. So glad to be with you. We are rounding the far turn. Maybe we're heading down the home stretch on our conversation about reincarnation, karma, and the chakras. And we're up to the part where we're talking about how karma is stored in the spine and what we should do about it. So let's start with a prayer and then we'll talk. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Guide us and bless us, that we may understand in the deepest part of ourselves who we are, why we were born, and how we can expand our ability to experience joy and then share that joy with all. We are your children. Bring us home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. Yesterday, whatever that was in your sequence of watching this, but the session that I gave just before this one, numerically, we really talked at great length about what is a vritti, how is a vritti formed, and how do those vrittis impact us. Vritti is a whirlpool of energy with some dominating thought in the middle of it that causes us to make all kinds of decisions based on it. And the vritti is the vehicle by which karma expresses itself in the material world and is carried incarnation to incarnation because it's an energy pattern. Now, I'm just going to sort of do a number of things around that a little bit to help get us vividly in mind. The next phase, whether I'll get to it today or whether it's going to take a couple of more sessions, but we are getting toward the end here, is given that the vrittis are there in the chakras, what can you do to help dissolve them as an alternative to just letting them blow up in our lives and living through them? You know, how can we free the trapped energy is what we're really talking about. The whole spiritual path is about freeing the trapped energy. In Patanjali's definition of yoga, and I don't mean yoga practice, but yoga as the end point of all our practices, not meaning yoga postures, but yoga meaning union of the individual jiva with the infinite reality of which it is a part, which is the river reaching the sea, basically, and then merging into the ocean, the great ocean of spirit. That's what yoga actually means, union. He said it's the neutralization of the vortices, which is an English word for vrittis, of Chitta, Chitta is the feeling aspect of nature, of our nature. There's much more that could be said about Chitta, but I don't want to go in too many different directions. But essentially, what that definition also says, referring to the vrittis, is that the vrittis are held together not merely impersonally, but they're held together because we have a personal feeling about it. And that personal feeling that we have has to do, and you see I keep repeating these same themes because over the course of many years I've come to understand if we can solve it in this way, then we free everything. And the key feelings are, I think this will make me happy, I think this will help me avoid suffering. And then there's a self-definition involved that I am vulnerable, I am susceptible to these forces, they cause me to suffer, they cause me to be happy. And so I joke about it, it's also everything we do because we think it's going to bring us the result we want. And the phrase I use to help ease my own sense of guilt or regret is it seemed like a good idea at the time. Because if it didn't seem like a good idea at the time, we wouldn't have done it. Misguided, yes. But it seemed like a good idea at the time. It's a very easy mantra to remember and a very realistic one. It's like when I was in, Swami had to correct me a lot over the first many years. He had to correct me a lot to the end, really, because I tended to take my errors very seriously. I thought it would help me to be really harsh, was the word he used. If I was really harsh with myself, somehow I thought that would act as a crime deterrent. It didn't really, but I used a lot of energy in that way. So I had to find out ways. Now you see, now think about this, even the tendency to become very anxious about one's foibles is a vritti. There's a point in the center, and it's very interesting. Now, I'm talking about my own psychology because this is the best way I know how to explain it. Often there's a theme to our vrittis, there's a theme to our center points, and often for many people, I'm not the only one here, but fear is often a very strong center point of vrittis, and that my whole discussion yesterday was about fear of conflict, which made me appear harmonious, but the center point of the vritti was not harmony. It was fear, and then all that I had to do to protect that fear. So it's often fear. So being very harsh with one's mistakes, harsh with oneself for one's mistakes, is for me, and is almost always a fear. That, that I'm in fact worthless, that God really won't love me, that whatever talents I've been gifted with are just going to be squandered, and in the end it'll just be a despicable mess. I mean, just go like that. But it wasn't funny. It was very, very real. And that fear of failure was what it was about. It's peculiar, but we all have it, because we have failed many times in the past. We have been excoriated for failure. We have excoriated ourselves for failure. It's all, the thing is, and I often say this to people, and this is a very important part of karma. People will come and they say, well, I know it's silly to feel this way. I know it's stupid to feel this way. I know I shouldn't feel this way. No, none of that. None of that is helpful. You see, that just creates one more vritti, and that vritti is it's not, it's putting yourself down. It's not, humility is not humiliation. Humility is not to say that I'm terrible. It's not self-abnegation. It's just to see yourself in a realistic light. Seemed like a good idea at the time. That's all. And in one of the times I was in a cycle like that, and the details I no longer remember. Swami had received a criticism of something I'd done. And the criticism was valid. Valid in the sense that my judgment had been very poor. But there were other factors involved. But the point is, at that point when I just began to feel crushed by, once again, I said something to the effect that, I intended something different. And Swami then quoted to me something Master had said to him, God reads the heart. And those are very few words, and it's not necessarily obvious. And what Swami actually said to me is, we are responsible for our intentions, karmically, but we're not responsible for how other people receive us. Now, if we are consistently getting a result that isn't desirable, it behooves us to try to think about how to improve our methods. But it seemed like a good idea at the time. I meant well. Maybe to everybody else, it was just completely, how could you possibly have thought that was a good idea? But I did. I just did. The center vritti that I was actually operating from was a desire to be helpful. But there's karma there, because my desire to be helpful is not a clear, intuitive channel yet. But it seemed like a good idea at the time. I did the best. I got feedback. That tells me that even though my intention is good. And see, what Swami was saying by telling me that God reads the heart is, there's no point in being upset with yourself. You had a good intention, you just happened to be wrong. Swamiji tried to get me to understand that merely to be wrong, merely to make a mistake, is not the same as to be condemned to hell forever. And merely to make a mistake, meaning that one's judgment is poor, and therefore the karma comes back on you, because one's judgment is poor. What was I missing? What was I not understanding? What part of helping other people did I not quite get? And then we get to learn. So we have multiple things that we have to do when we work with karma from the point of view of introspection. And one of them is to just be genuinely interested in, wow, that's amazing feedback. And sometimes also you see the karma is coming to you because of actions from previous lifetimes. You've set, because there's another aspect to the karma. I've been talking about the verities, but there's also whatever we do because we're identified with it. And I talked about this before. Swamiji did not define himself as Kriyananda. Kriyananda was an event for which he was responsible. Master had no sense of individual separate self. He lived in the ocean, and the ocean had all these different waves, but he didn't define himself by one wave and therefore separate himself from another wave. He was all the waves, and it all happened, but it didn't necessarily happen specifically to him. Whereas because I think that I'm much more Asha than I am anybody else, every time Asha does something, Asha remembers it. The jiva that is Asha remembers it as my experience. Or I do something that is not quite in balance with divine law, and I have to learn to get more in balance with divine law. So a lot of our actions are the perfect images, they're boomerangs. And I've never held a boomerang in my hand, and I've never thrown one, but it's that kind of U, half like a V, half like a U-shaped object, wooden object, that people learn to throw in a certain way. And when you throw it in a certain way, you throw it to the right, perhaps, but it makes a circle, and then it comes back to you from the left. So you set the energy in motion here, but the energy returns to you from another place. And it's your momentum the whole way through, so it's a marvelous image. So if I, for example, take advantage of the weakness of someone else, and I increase my wealth at their expense, and it seemed like a good idea to me at the time, either because I was so selfish or whatever it was, I just rationalized it, which we often do. And what I've done, though, is it's an aberration in the divine law. So I've set in motion this aberration that sooner or later is going to have to come back and hit me here and knock me back into alignment by my tears, by my suffering, by the fact that somebody takes advantage of me and takes all my money. And when it comes back to us, we no longer remember that we ourselves sent it out. Okay? So, because that karma, because of what Master called, and this is how it works, because of what he called excuse me a second. What he called the conflicting cross currents of ego. Because we're not so simple as I'm just a mean person taking money. The fact that I had enough power to be in a position to take your money, that I was smart enough to know that I wanted your money, that I was deluded enough to know that I wanted your money, but I was powerful enough because I have money. You can see how all these cross currents work. But this is metaphysics. This is mathematics. This is metaphysical mathematics. And this goes back to everything I've been saying. We need to move all the way from delusion to absolute freedom. And that means that every little aberration has to be straightened out. We have to see it and understand it. Oh.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Okay, I have a question from someone in the room. Uh-huh.
Does good karma have a verity?
the question was asked me, is there such a thing as a good vritti? And yes. And yes, you build good vrittis. See, this is how you work it. Eventually, you want to have no vrittis. But if you have negative vrittis, one of the ways you balance them is you create positive vrittis. You create, now bear in mind, this is nothing but magnetic fields playing against each other, drawing the river's trying to get to the sea, and these whirlpools are created. And some of the whirlpools may be more beautiful, may be stronger, may be weaker, may move the energy forward. I guess the whirlpool example doesn't quite work, but it's close. But if we have been very selfish and we don't want to be selfish anymore, we create a vritti called, I love helping people. It makes me so happy. And I've begun to figure out where happiness comes from. I realize that happiness does not come from taking advantage of others, even though I get a lot of stuff I want. Happiness comes from giving. A friend of mine who was very comfortable and was in a position to be very generous to people, but was just learning to be generous. On several occasions, he gave to me and to other people. He had access to automobiles, just in the position that he was in, and he gave me an automobile. He gave an automobile to a couple of other people, not a brand new one, but a used one, but a good one. But I remember him telling me, and I had to keep a straight face with some surprise, how happy it made him to give away one of these automobiles, even though he could easily afford to do it. But he was discovering that it was more fun to give them away than to sell them, or to use them in some way to make profit for himself. So he was creating a good vritti, so he was moving up the food chain. Literally, if you think of it as the karma, remember I said it's a vibration between matter is the only reality and divinity is the only reality? And you move up. You have a lot of karma and you kind of move the whole crew up. But the higher you get vibrationally, the clearer and the freer you get, and the more easily it is to make the next step. And see even what little bit that vritti is, how even that is holding you. And it's holding you not because it's wrong action. It's holding you because you still think that you're the one doing it. And so what you really have to get rid of entirely is the egoic self-definition based on your own actions. That's why I keep repeating Swami Kriyananda and Master, because they looked like they were living just the way you and I are living. But the difference was they knew themselves to be part of the ocean. So when the wave that had Kriyananda's name on it wrote a book or sang a song or received accolades or did something that was terribly humiliating and was excoriated or lost a big lawsuit, which we did at a certain point, and just all this stuff, it happened. But it was just the wave that was Kriyananda going through its story, and he was involved, he had to pay attention, but it was never him. It was like his surfboard or something that he was watching. He's swimming in the ocean watching his surfboard do something. It's his surfboard, he has to take care of it. But it wasn't him, so there was no vritti, because there was no place for it to stick. The energy just passed through. The river was in a whirlpool, the river flooded, the river was, did this, the trees fell into the river, but he was just the river moving to the sea, and all of that was just entertainment along the way. Educational and entertainment, or even other people's karma that he was working out. There's a lot involved there. But good karma is good because it teaches us a higher truth than bad karma. That's the only difference. Bad karma locks us into a small vision. Good karma begins to open us to a larger self-definition. Okay, and then eventually all vrittis cease because there's nobody home. There's nobody to have the vritti. And if you then incarnate in that state, you come entirely in attunement at the spiritual eye. There's no identification at the medulla. There's energy because you have to have a body, but the identification is at the spiritual eye. Swamiji made the statement once, which he rarely said things like this about himself, but he commented like this. He said, that in his dreams, in his subconscious mind, he was always exactly the same as he was in his conscious mind. That was one thing that he said once. And then there was another context where, of all things, an aura photograph was taken of him. And the woman who took the picture, it was all indigo blue with just this little bit of magenta up here. The person who interpreted the picture said the magenta was, she didn't know anything about who he was, that this is the angels who take care of you. But she'd never seen a picture like that. He was totally covered. He was almost obscured by all this indigo blue. In other conversations, we talked about the fact, Swami, sometimes Swami would say something and then while he was living, he didn't want it really talked about. But what he essentially said is there was no vritis in his chakras, which means he had no subconscious, you see. Vritis in your chakras are subconscious. It's karma that is still there, it's still part of you. Subconscious I'm using in a slightly different way than psychologists might use it. But it's just unresolved issues that still have to be faced. And I don't think Swami had any. He went through lots of experiences. This is a whole different subject. That's called a jivan mukta, is what that's called. Where, things are still happening, but there's no ego to which it is attached. But to us, it's attached. So coming back, through this, you set this boomerang in motion, but because you have conflicting cross currents of ego, think of it like this. This is, forgive me, you've heard this image before, but it says it clearly. We are the same from when we're children. We're born, you see, with all of these vritis in our chakras, and they express as they need to, appropriate for the level. So you're 10 years old, and you have vritis that say, I have a lot of power, and I like to show my power over people who are smaller. In other words, you're a mean-spirited bully, okay? So there's some little 3-year-old kid, and he's on his tricycle, and he's sort of in the driveway of his house, and he's, just trying to have a good time, and you're 10, and you come shooting down the sidewalk on your bicycle, and you see that kid, and just as you go by, you kind of turn your wheel enough to knock him off his tricycle, and then just keep going, and I'm so powerful. And you think you've gotten away with it. Because you're bigger, you can just keep going. But what you've actually done is you've set a boomerang out, and don't think just because you're 10, you get away with it. I mean, God is no tyrant. It all happens appropriately. It all happens as it should for our help. God loves us and is trying to help us. But you set out this boomerang of being a bully and getting pleasure from, showing that you're more powerful than those who are weaker than you. And unless something rescues him, let's say nothing rescues him, and he remains kind of a bully. The little kid, however, is smart and persistent and patient. He doesn't like being knocked over, but he remembers. And maybe these two kids had lots of experience as they grew up. The little kid who was on the tricycle becomes quite successful, let's say, as the local banker. And the bully is trying to make his way in the same town, and, because he's a bully, things are not going so well, and he needs a loan. So he goes into the bank, and he's sitting across from the 3-year-old kid. And the 3-year-old kid may not even remember. But he will find somehow that this man is not a good risk and he can't have the loan. And so the karma will come home to roost. That's all. And so a lot of things that happen to us that we think don't make any sense actually make perfect sense. They're just boomerangs that we set out, and we have to, and see, this is where the law of karma changes everything. Everything that happens to me is perfectly fair. I remember a very odd experience I had where people thought I had done something that I hadn't done. And it was not a very admirable thing, but I hadn't done it. But there was a strange sense within me that not in this lifetime did I do it, but I had done it before, and I had gotten away with it. I mean, I couldn't see the life. I didn't have like that kind of experience. But I knew that this completely false accusation was absolutely fair and true. It just was. I could feel it inside of me. I'd sent the boomerang out, and it was now hitting me on the side of the head, and I had absolutely no grounds for complaint. So I made a very small effort to set the record straight and then just let it go. Just why bother? Which is one of the teachings that Swami has in one of his books, Sadhu Beware, which is how to overcome the ego. When people misunderstand you, why do you need to make them understand you? I mean, within reason. These all have to be applied with common sense. But part of it is accept being misunderstood. You've probably imposed it on others. Don't make it the source of happiness or suffering. What causes happiness? What causes suffering? You see how all of these things work together? And now there's another factor which this is important. I mean, I was actually, what I was hesitating is I only have a couple of minutes, so I'll introduce it, but maybe I'll say the whole thing. The only purpose, karma, is simply unlearned lessons. Now, much of the time, the karma needs to explode into material manifestation before we become aware of it and are willing to take action. What I said yesterday, when the effort to change it seems less painful than the pain of remaining as you are, has to be at that tipping point. And much of the time, that means it has to explode into material manifestation before that happens. Now, the rest of the classes are going to be, but you could also just deal with the vritti directly. And that's where meditation, affirmations, right living, right attitude, many things come into play. And we will go there. But just talking about in this context, most of the time it has to come into material manifestation. But not because in and of itself it has to happen. It's because it's an unlearned lesson that you have to learn. So if you can get a little ahead of the curve and sort of, instead of waiting to be hit over the head with a returning boomerang, one is eager to change one's life. One is eager to see one's faults and to correct them. One is eager to understand how I can expand instead of how I can contract. In another class I was talking about, I have an image that I've always loved. We have to go to the light. We will go to the light. The river, it's the nature of the river to merge into the sea. It's the nature of the jiva to realize its oneness with infinity. We will do it. Just depends, as Swami said once, we may waste a few million years or we can go more quickly. It's really up to us. Ideally, we see the beautiful vision of the light and we run toward it. Alternatively, we catch fire from behind and we try to run away from the fire. We don't have to suffer, but suffer motivates us. So if we're not in motion, if we have our heads in the sand, if we've put our heads in a bucket and hope that the world will just change while our head's in the bucket, then we have to catch fire from behind because we've got to move toward the sea. So if we can learn the lesson, then several things happen. We have an aura of energy around us, and that aura of energy around us is an exact expression of our vibrations. And our vibrations are created by our verities. So if we've been creating lots of good vibrations because we've been shifting from selfishness to expansiveness, from harsh misery to joy, then the aura around us has a particular quality and strength to it. The boomerang, I mean, these are all just images, but the boomerang comes around like a meteor trying to get to Earth. It meets our aura, and if, since the time we sent it out, we have already radically changed, and otherwise learned the lesson the boomerang is here to teach us, again, metaphysics, that energy field, which is the boomerang, will meet the energy field, which is our aura. And if the aura is very strong, just like a meteor, much of the vibrations of the boomerang will be changed into the vibrations of your aura. So there may be a little bit of dissonance. Let's say we've done maybe we'll have a bad dream. Or maybe we were destined to have our arm cut off, and instead we'll get a bad bruise. That something will happen. The energy has to be fulfilled, but it was fulfilled by me, but the aura took care of most of it, and it didn't, only a little bit had to burst into manifested form. And then there's something called the grace of God, which is where we're going to go tomorrow. God bless you.